Assassin's Creed Mirage was an important release for the series. It claimed that the series would go back to its roots and that the game would harken back to what made the series special. Hidden blades, hoods, and social stealth were coming back, baby, and you know what? That was relatively true. The game in many ways felt like the old Assassin's Creed, and color me foolish for thinking it would be enough to please the old school fans because oh boy did it feel like no one cared about this game. I guess talking about a solid entry in the series isn't as interesting as demonizing one of the RPG games or reminiscing about the good old days, but still, reactions were a mix of people saying it either saved the series and people saying it's another nail in a coffin that is one step away from being encased in concrete. Most simply called it mediocre. The struggle seemed not in the iconography, references, or the feeling of Assassin's Creed, but rather the design itself. Ironic how one could accurately say it was a bad game, but not a bad Assassin's Creed game. In the few months since the game's release, there have been some large updates, most notably to movement, that justify a deeper look at the game. Since I know many of you saw my smaller review of the game, I feel inclined to mention that this video will be fundamentally different in that my reviews are made with the objective of determining if a product is, in my opinion, worth the money. Whereas the larger critiques, or whatever you want to call them, are more about looking at the game as a piece of art, disconnected from its price. I want to see down to the little details what Mirage did right, what it did wrong, and in this case, if and how my thoughts have changed since release. If you remember my review, then you remember that I liked the game and generally recommended it. That hasn't changed here. In fact, if it has, it's more so in the game's favor, and mostly due to a post-launch update that we'll unpack later. So let's not delay. Leading up to the release of Mirage, I'd argue I was less skeptical of its claims and more in pure disbelief. The last time I heard Ubisoft say they were heading back to their roots was with Valhalla, and it was the furthest I'd ever seen the series stray from what made it special. Still, I enjoyed Valhalla to an extent and I enjoyed what it went for, but was still convinced that Ubisoft was ironically done trying to go back to the past in a series all about it. When Mirage released, in many ways I felt like we returned to the series' roots, despite my pessimism going into it. I'm left with the feeling that this game desperately needed to save the series, and unfortunately, I don't think it's enough. I'm sorry, Mirage, but you weren't enough to save the series. But I still have hope that the spark you ignited is enough to rekindle this series nearly suffocated in the ashes of its former success. If Mirage had one goal in mind, it was to create an old Assassin's Creed game. But there are a few problems with that objective. Let's acknowledge the first, which is that an old Assassin's Creed game isn't good enough anymore. Look, I love the older games as much as the next guy, but think about the games people call their favorite. The first game, 2, Black Flag, Unity. What these games all have in common is innovation. The first Assassin's Creed was a new IP. The second polished a lot of the rough edges. Black Flag took a tiring formula and gave it new life by remixing old tricks and shifting our perspective. And Unity aimed to refine and redefine the mechanics at the heart of the series. Mirage is the first Assassin's Creed to have the conscious goal of being such, and thus it is an insecure product from its inception. The best Assassin's Creeds were those about politics, revenge, piracy, mystery, not about being an assassin. This tone is seen throughout Mirage, the idea that the appeal is the assassins. Basim is given little characterization before he becomes infatuated with the assassins, seeing them as a way to escape his menial life. It's something that works in his favor. I love seeing a character with high ambitions, but so much of Basim is motivated by joining the Assassin Brotherhood, and once it happens, I was left with this feeling of, well, now what? I'll admit, I love the training sequence in Alamut. It's slow, lets you breathe, lets you really understand that it takes a while to complete assassin training. I would have liked to have seen Basim's nature play a larger role here, because that's what made previous training sequences interesting. Things like impatience are shut down quickly, and he is more than willing to do whatever it takes to devote himself to the assassins. Maybe this introduction is trying to prey on our desire to have a back-to-basics Assassin's Creed story, and every time I replay the game, it works. Alamut is a beautiful place that genuinely feels secluded. Most of the important locations are within caves, and it resides far from where most of the game takes place. When talking about a return to form and a return to games about assassins, it's not all about the iconography. This is something Mirage mostly understands, but certain elements such as bureaus having a massive Hidden One symbol outside of them make me feel as though these symbols are not tools for the Hidden Ones to find their hideouts, but tools for the creators to make me see this game as more of a return to form than it actually is. We have the HUD, we have a map, and the bureaus are the only locations to have an open roof entrance. We don't need further direction. It might be disingenuous to think the developers are playing a big con and convincing us that this will be the return to form that they said it would be, but it has also happened before in its previous installment. That said, the post-launch support for Mirage is the greatest argument for Bordeaux's authenticity. When Mirage released, it saw decent enough reviews, and I saw plenty of players falling in love with it, and I was one of them. But that love grew when, even as of writing this, there's solid post-launch support. We have the inclusion of New Game Plus, a permadeath mode, quality of life features like being able to change the visuals of an item while retaining its stats, free robes, and get this, parkour enhancements so vast that they change the way the game can be played. I'll get to the quality of the side and back ejects later, but for now, the point is that none of these features needed to be added after the fact. right, they aren't behind a paywall. There's no catch, just improvements for the sake of it. So when, in yet another free update, the game gets both an Altair costume and a legacy filter to make it look like Assassin's Creed 1, I'm not convinced that this was done to profit from nostalgia. The game's been out, people have started forgetting about it. It looks to me like those who worked on the game genuinely cherished the foundations that Assassin's Creed was built upon. Now, discussions of developer intentions are difficult, because if I try to argue that the devs loved the older games, someone will surely ask, why are side ejects and back ejects not in the game on launch? And I don't have an answer. I could theorize that this game's conception as an expansion to Valhalla and the deadlines placed by higher-ups could have inhibited their ability to truly rework a system that was never created with such tools in mind, but then we're in a sea of hypotheticals, and I'd rather not have the video drown in that. If I can't convince you that the game was made with love, I can at least say with confidence that it wasn't made with hate. Mirage does not look at its past with contempt or pretend it never existed, and even if their mission to bring us back to the good old days is an impossible task, it's at least a noble one. The beginning and end of the game, the parts most notably not about the assassins, are brief, and while that is a good thing in the sense that this game sees you as an assassin for most of the game, we miss a bit of the man under the hood. If your favorite assassin is Ezio, let me ask why. Is it because he's an assassin? Unlikely. It's probably because of his charm, the suave, the morals, and the dedication he shows. So now we have a Basim that is poor, lighthearted, and, well, I guess that's about it. Still, I can appreciate that he, like us, just wants to join the assassins and get to the training. Once we finish the introduction, we can move onwards to Baghdad. In the beginning of the game, in Anbar, we get a slice of what Baghdad offers, but once we finally make it, and ride our camel into its array of streets both on and above the ground, it offers grandeur and density, something that has been slim thus far. What I like most about the Ring City is that it gets denser and more vibrant the further you move inwards. If you follow where the questline leads, you'll at first see the production-based districts. Further in, we'll find denser streets with more flora as we see the more residential and market-like areas, but at its center, the streets are full of the rich, the flora grows all over both the city and the color palette. For myself, the peaks of Assassin's Creed world design have always been Assassin's Creed 2 and Unity. Something about the dense streets, the architecture that protrudes so often that they become staircases to the rooftops, allowing us to soar above the streets like a superhero swinging over the populace, is never quite recaptured in the wilderness of Greece. Baghdad is dense, it's populated, it's vibrant, and yet the wilderness surrounding the city is desolate, stale, and otherwise uninteresting compared to the city that acts as a beacon shining from any angle. Once inside, we find a populace that litters the streets, and one can't go more than a few feet without seeing a pathway to the rooftops, and when tailing, chasing, or otherwise observing, having easy access to elevation is important when living the assassin fantasy. There are two elements to why parkour worked in the series' infancy. The first was that it was plain cool to see someone dive into a haystack, realism be damned, and no matter the context, jumping across rooftops is fun. The other element that made it cool was the necessity of it. Elevation is useful for evading authority, surveying surroundings, and for getting somewhere in a timely fashion. When navigating the streets, you need to obey the bends in the street, the people in the way. The architecture binds you and makes movement inefficient unless it's a straight line between point A and B. Coasting above the streets allows you to make your own, more direct path to an objective. But of course, we're forgetting something, aren't we? Expression. The way we move is a form of expression. Ever notice that people have certain quirks when moving? Any avid Warzone player in 2020 likely has a habit of trying to slide cancel in every FPS game, whether it's effective or not. Maybe you bunny hop everywhere you go. The point is, the more freedom we have with movement, the more we can express ourselves, and this, to me, directly correlates with how much fun players have. So let's look at the architecture. We have bricks jutting out for climbing, posts and boxes beckoning us to the real streets, and tight corridors that make my mind run wild with all the ways we can climb it, and yet, there's nothing here. The parkour is still, holding X and pressing forward. No side ejects, back ejects, free dropping. My disappointment was immeasurable. But my day isn't ruined, because these features were added later in a patch. Side ejecting and back ejecting truly do change the way the game is played, but it doesn't fix the deeper issues with movement, which is that they fundamentally serve a different function. In the early games, you controlled your position. Now, you control your animations. Need proof? Jump in any of the older games. Go ahead. Now try it in the newer games. Now I know, whoop-de shit, you can't jump in place, but that's not all. You can't jump anywhere. You may only clear gaps, but only if on a flat surface can you jump freely. This isn't a massive issue. In fact, throughout my playthrough, there was never a moment where I wanted to jump freely. But the point is that without this freedom, we aren't given true expression. And this applies to the side ejects too. Again, to go back to the older games, side ejecting was an ability that took place independent of anything else. And sure, at times it looked janky, but it also maintained utility. Now we can only side eject in very specific scenarios, and there are plenty of moments where you simply can't perform the move when you really should be able to. For example, you can only eject upwards, not downwards, and only if there is something for you to jump towards. In earlier entries, things looked janked because we weren't following a script. We were given some magnetism to avoid any miscalculations, but you could miss. Here, you cannot do those moves freely, and that that would be fine if the game always knew what I wanted to do, but it doesn't. And when you give us these tools with heavy restrictions on how we utilize them, that's not freedom, it's just a longer leash. Said leash is still good. Look at the reaction to this game on Twitter. People were trying to make movement montages in this. The funny thing is, this is the same system as Valhalla, and people never made compilations like that. Now, even before the ejects were added in, we had players who were convinced that they could express themselves, this time desperately trying to. They remapped the controls to make it feel like the old game, and in their expert movement videos, they incorporated slides to fill the gap between jumps. There's no utility to these slides. It's simply, plainly, a cry for help. Players see the level design and are dying to express themselves. A further issue with the training wheels-esque movement we have right now is that it still doesn't work. There is so much jank here, so many times where I went somewhere I didn't intend to, tried to execute a move that by all theory should be possible, and yet the game would refuse. Until you get an upgrade that borderline negates fall damage, parkour is given tension because falling is proper punishment. But on a recent playthrough, every time I took fall damage was from a moment that I didn't intend. As in, I tried to perform a jump and the game refused. What makes movement like parkour engaging is the danger aspect. If you slip, you could die, and if you die and it's not your fault, it makes me not want to experiment, and in some cases, not want to play at all. Allow us to make mistakes, and assuming those mistakes are of our own doing, then it'll be fun to learn. So an obvious question is begging to be asked. Why did you praise it? In my review, I said parkour was disappointing, but that it was a good step in the right direction. And I've had many people say that why would you praise something that was arguably perfected nearly 2 decades ago? The answer is simply that I want to encourage Ubisoft to keep going. If I cross my arms and pout at them saying, "This isn't good," they might get the idea that they should once again abandon solid movement. I believe it's more productive to say, yeah, the system isn't where it could or arguably should be, but this is a good start. If Ubisoft sees games like this selling well, ones with movement much deeper than those of the last few years, it would follow that they would then try to make those systems better. Maybe that's putting too much faith in Ubisoft though. So yeah, movement needs work. But with that said, what we have is a step in the right direction. And while a step in the right direction isn't enough to warrant spending money on the game or to save the series, it's certainly worth praising a little. Fortunately, disconnected from the mechanics, I love the design of Baghdad from a gameplay perspective. It's full of life and opportunities, especially in the stealth department. Something Bordeaux understood deeply when developing Mirage is that social stealth is much more than hiding in plain sight, more than sitting in a crowd or on a bench. It's about blending into society, and that includes someone's actions. Looking normal isn't necessarily about what you wear, but how you act. Running draws attention, crouching does too, and blending in with a crowd allows you to utilize the people to your advantage. In Valhalla, we had crowd blending, but it was never necessary, and in fact, because so many of the towns in that game were sparse with wide roads, even if I wanted to use social stealth, it was extremely difficult. The other aspect of social stealth that is important is not just the execution, but the planning phase. A typical stealth mission, of which there are plenty in Mirage, will see you scouting from a vantage point and using either a bird or eagle vision to magically highlight your target. Social stealth will see you talking to people, eavesdropping, getting involved in their world. We see this executed excellently during the auction, where we find our target by listening to others, slowly walking around the market, gaining the privilege to meet our target face to face. This is presented elsewhere, like when we wear disguises and draw our targets out of hiding. In most instances, we have a choice between traditional hiding in bushes stealth or using the society around us, and in both cases, it was fulfilling on multiple playthroughs. I think the ability to crouch, hiding spots, and the generally unforgiving detection speed make this a game where planning is necessary, and if on permadeath, that goes doubly so. Unfortunately, there's one ability Basim has that, to me, breaks the game in some unbelievable ways. This was a point of contention long before the game released, but the assassin teleport ability is honestly pretty cool. Does it sour immersion? Not entirely, you don't have to use it, but the real issue stems from balance. Filling the meter happens naturally, and if used as the game intends for, it feels redundant. I don't need the ability to take out a group of enemies. I have multiple tools that allow for it. In fact, some of those tools, like the smoke bomb, allow me to take those same enemies out and not leave myself exposed. The real utility is in using this ability to traverse areas that would otherwise be difficult, and I believe this exposes some balance issues, but I also don't want it to change. During a mission, there's a part of a wall under construction, perfect for us to exploit, but there are guards all over it. This is meant to be an appetizer of sorts for the larger guard presence within, and yet I skipped the entire thing by using Assassin Focus to kill the guard on top. Now, it is true that this can be used to negate fall damage, skip sections, and get out of tight spots, but I think it's most fun this way. Balance be damned, when I use my focus in a clever way, I feel rewarded, and as far as stealth goes, I can't ask for much more from the game. Another rewarding aspect of stealth is when problems are solved with the environment. Sandbags can cause a puff of smoke, pots can be thrown or broken to cause an explosion. There's plenty here to manipulate situations and to express yourself. I can place restrictions however I like. For example, on one playthrough, I tried not to use the Assassin Focus at all, and it made me consult the tools at Basim's disposal far more. Smoke bombs shroud you, throwing knives destroy things, skulls included. Traps, noisemakers, poison darts, all the usuals are here, and once all are unlocked, I found myself enjoying the stealth more than any of the RPG games, and it's simply because I had choices. In some instances, I would try to use my environment, really improvise. In others, I'd try to blend with the crowds more. Maybe I'd only use the hidden blade. The point is, I bet you a majority of people by the end of their playthroughs didn't unlock all the tools, and that's because they aren't needed. When stealth is more than crawling through bushes, I'm more inclined to engage with it over combat. And as I've mentioned many times in the past, Mirage heavily discourages combat. Combat was yet another way the series had returned to its roots, this time in making combat a defensive practice. While I can admit that chain killing fulfills a power fantasy unlike many other systems, it did make combat trivial. In the earliest entries, the combat was all about finding and exploiting weaknesses, and it was generally defensive. This holds true in Mirage as well, and I actually found the combat to be the most challenging parts of the game. You aren't given a ton of time to react, and the different timings for enemies with different weapons consistently kept me on my toes when I wasn't using a smoke bomb to virtually skip the fight, but hey, let's just ignore that. I surely could criticize the combat for being without depth, and yeah, that's true, but in every instance, the game basically screams for you to avoid it, so I think its simplicity is excused. It's a last-ditch effort, only to be engaged with when there's no other option. In most combat encounters, the best strategy was to run away. Something I never realized about Assassin's Creed was how important the chase was. Hell, the last time I even felt the slightest incentive to run away from combat was Assassin's Creed 2, and that ties into the way combat evolved to make you a powerhouse preying on whatever unlucky guard was scheduled for that night. When we're weaker outside the shadows, we can justify wanting to return to the shade as quickly as possible, and thus, running away from combat is given utility. In Mirage, such easy access to the rooftops makes getting away from guards easy, but remaining undetected for long enough is where the challenge comes in. Guards patrol every street, many litter rooftops. Your escape is a fast-paced, high-intensity sprint away from one sight line and ensuring you don't enter another along the way. Once they catch up to you, they may check around in hiding spots, and now there's tension in if they'll find you. It all contributes to the way Basim as a person operates, which is in very sneaky, mischievous ways. Perhaps that's less attributed to Basim and more to the other inside him, but either way, replaying the game, having this added context behind his tool belt is interesting. I've talked about the gameplay a lot in terms of the everyday excursion, but the bread and butter of Mirage are the black box assassinations that cap off each investigation. After the first hour, a clear gameplay loop is introduced, where we begin with a few leads on a member of the Order, find enough clues to locate said member, and then take them out. Finding said leads was always really engaging and most importantly, varied. I know Mirage wants to go back to the roots of Assassin's Creed 1, but I am very glad Mirage didn't imitate the repetitive structure of the first game. Sometimes we'll eavesdrop, tail people, free people from prison, steal an item for someone with information. I never felt like I was just going through the motions. I think the black box assassinations were always something I felt disappointed in, which is a hot take, but it's rooted in the idea that they can sometimes feel more linear than a regular mission. For example, on the first black box, you always need to lure out your target, and yes, there are two ways of doing it, but this mission quickly lost its luster on repeat playthroughs. You always need the hairpin and seal to meet with Ning. It seems to follow a clear formula of scout for 2 opportunities, get access to where the target is, and escape. I might be coming off as not enjoying these. I do, they're the highlights of the game, and some like the prison break or the final assassination reward players on repeat playthroughs because there are some opportunities only noticeable from the inside. I just wish it was even more open, but maybe I'm asking for too much. Something difficult about criticizing anything in Mirage is that on almost all fronts, it's better than the most recent entries. Does that make it good on its own merits? Maybe not, but to pretend like it isn't the first game with some truly great stealth in the last few years would be wrong. I can't pretend like any of this was a deal breaker because I played Mirage 3 separate times since launch, and on every playthrough, I was having fun, so that's gotta count for something. I think the biggest reason Mirage is better than its predecessors is that it knows when to quit. Valhalla was a 10-hour game ballooned to 20 times that size, and it made the entire experience tiring, even if fundamentally, there were things to enjoy. Mirage focuses on delivering a digestible story that doesn't overstay its welcome, and the side content is great too, for not just giving more excuses for us to engage with the gameplay, but also for strengthening our connection to the world. The surrounding wilderness isn't much in terms of content, but I appreciated that the desert, mirages, make a return, as we can see Basim's inner demons frolicking in the demonic dust the wind kicks up. Tales of Baghdad see us meeting with the populace, though not in any exceedingly memorable ways. Hey, my treasure's locked in a sunken house, or, I can't find a specific grave in a graveyard of maybe 5 gravestones. Certain collectibles inside dungeons can be fun. In fact, I always found myself enjoying stumbling upon a cave full of bandits and having a linear gauntlet of goons to mow through. The best of this, though, is when our friend Nihal points us to a precursor site, and after a long swim, we find 3 chambers that eventually open and grant us the Isu armor. Compared to previous Isu quests like those in Origins, I found this to not hold up the same, but the excitement was still there. If these side quests are meant to be short, then I can appreciate them for being side tangents that aren't necessarily made to take a lot of time. Unlocking the aforementioned Isu armor is done by finding shards around the map, and it wasn't uncommon for me to put what I was doing on hold to nab a shard, and the same goes for Diri's artifacts. Perhaps the game wants us to focus on the story at hand, and I can respect that, but I'd respect it more if the story was better. The beginning moves quickly, and I loved exploring Alamut, even if I wish we could return to it. But once you get into the city and complete your first contract, you're given 3 members of the Order to discover in whatever order order you choose. At first this was great, I love this kind of freedom, but it works against the story, and this freedom does not imply non-linearity. The 3 contracts all follow the same cycle of collecting clues, assassinating a low-ranking member, and then taking down the head honcho. Where things get especially frustrating is when on a second playthrough, because you realize how on rails these investigations are. During one mission, I knew someone I needed to assassinate was in a building accessible by a window. Unfortunately, that window was blocked until I eavesdropped to learn the person was there, and then read a note about the window being opened. This situation is not unique, and while I can at least praise the game for having varied missions, forcing me to complete the clue gathering on a second playthrough kills the pacing, especially when there's no mystery to be solved. I just have to once again prove to the game that I get it. This is one way where Mirage is inferior to the older games, especially Odyssey. Shit on it all we like, but the Order members in Odyssey, at least almost all of them, were living characters. They had roles, locations, and stats independent of the player. Hands down, one of my favorite moments in the entire Assassin's Creed series was when I accidentally killed an NPC in Odyssey and realized after the fact that I killed a member of the Order. Furthermore, I could find and eliminate those members by either using all of the clues, at which point they would be marked on the map, or find them early with only half the clues. It made the investigation something that I conducted, not the game. Odyssey didn't make me show my work and redo all the steps like I'm in fucking primary school again, okay? Regardless, the biggest victim of these 3 missions is Basim himself. His story goes absolutely nowhere, and the visions of the Jinni are just visions over and over. I was excited to find out more about these nightmares, and eventually we do, but because these missions can be completed in any order, the visions maintain a tame, taunting nature for multiple hours. The body of the story. This harkens back to what I said in the beginning. A by-the-numbers Assassin's Creed game is what the series maybe needs, but don't forget the character stories told alongside the assassin stuff. Players who finished Valhalla's campaign, which if you did, you deserve a veteran's discount, will know what Basim turns into. The game should have spent more time playing off that how factor. We know the start point and we know where Basim is going to end up, but that in-between is where we can showcase a struggle, a possession, a gradient of some kind, but we get little. To the voice actor's credit, Basim's voice does change throughout the game, getting deeper and harsher as the game goes on, and this transition is very seamless. But in between our departure from Alamut and our return, we learn nothing of the Jinni, of Basim's growing distrust in the Brotherhood. Seeds are planted during the many conversations between Ali and Basim over the concept of freedom, but that is all. I'm fine with the focus of the second act being on the Order, and I don't want this to be misconstrued as me saying we need to go back to being a Viking. I'm just saying that Basim has been established in the opening act, and in Valhalla, let's do something with him. Eventually, that does thankfully happen. By the time you get to your final target, Rashawn is insistent that she deals with the head of the Order, but Basim, in wanting to interrogate the leader about the device, demands that he deal the killing blow. Once cornered, Kahib tells us that we're special, and that we're some kind of key, but before we find out more, Rashawn shows up and finishes the job. She pleads for Basim to abandon this, abandon his past, and focus on the future with the Brotherhood, lest she take him out herself. Despite this, our friendly Nihal encourages us to travel to Alamut, and upon doing so, we see that the Order's plans to seize Alamut are being fulfilled, and we rescue both the leader of the Brotherhood, Rahan, and enter the tomb beneath Alamut. Before we can enter, Rashawn tries to stop us, and we get a relatively decent boss fight, and I appreciate that the quick-witted players are rewarded for throwing a knife at Rashawn by being able to skip the first half of the fight. Once through, we enter an Isu temple, and honestly, I can't help but love every Isu structure we visit in these games. Something about the abstract, sleek structures buried under primitive civilizations look incredible, and within this bunker, we can enter a room that reveals Nihal. Basim is then shown visions of the Jinni, now revealed to be memories of a past life, and Nihal, too, is that past life. Fuck me, the lore for this series has gotten so convoluted, but here we go. During the events of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, it is revealed that a bunch of Isu, in order to survive the incoming catastrophe that wiped out the first civilization, transferred their consciousness into unborn humans. This is how Tyr showed up in Sigurd's mind, how Odin showed up in Eivor's, and how Loki showed up in Basim's mind. Whether this is the first time the Isu have shown up in a human is unconfirmed, but what matters for Mirage, more specifically this twist, is that Nihal is Loki, and Nihal wasn't real this whole time. Throughout the entire game, no one aside from Basim can see Nihal, and she continually knows information that doesn't make sense, and even says plainly,
I am a part of your reality too. I am your past.
Why Loki appears as Nihal and not as his true Asgardian form should be obvious. He's in disguise. And by the end of this realization, Basim chooses to have Loki take over, unlike Sigurd and Eivor. This twist retroactively explains a few inconsistencies with the game. For example, the assassin focus is explained as Basim moving so fast that the Animus can't process it, hence the glitching effect. And we can assume these abilities are granted by Loki within Basim. It also explains why Nihal showed so much interest in the Isu artifacts. It was a ploy to get released into Basim's brain. Not all is answered in this twist though, such as, how did no one hear Basim talking to someone? Did anyone question why he looked over at her and would, from their perspective, be staring off into space? Why not? I was also curious to know if this chamber's express purpose is to allow Loki to overtake the mind of their host. If that is the case, then could the other 3 rooms house the chambers for Tyr and Odin? Hopefully the sequel answers this. I've played the game 3 times, and maybe I keep missing clues, but there were plenty of unanswered questions by the end of the game. I don't think these are plot issues per se, but rather that I like the world Bordeaux has built and want to know more. How did Rashawn know about Basim's past? Rashawn constantly tells Basim to leave his past behind, to a suspicious degree, and even tries to kill him if he continues pursuing his past. How does she know this? I don't think these particular issues are a product of plot holes or anything, it's just a desire to learn more, but alas, the story where it stands is fine. I don't think this is one I'm gonna remember for a long time, and while it's by no means bad, it doesn't feel fleshed out. Basim's story is sidelined by the assassins, and I feel bad criticizing this because it makes me seem like a jackass. I know, I was the guy saying we need to return to form, and I maintain that, but we need the story to be more than a throwback. It needs to stand on its own. And I've seen the opinion that the story is at its best during both the introduction and conclusion, and I agree, but it's because the story has nothing in between that. I don't like doing this, but I want to offer some ideas on how the story could be changed for the better. And I say this with humility and acknowledgement that I am critiquing this from my cushy office. I don't have suits watching over me. I don't have to run my ideas through a million filters. That said, I think the thing that makes Basim most interesting in the beginning and ending is that he has an understandable motivation. In Anbar, Basim wants to join the Hidden Ones to help and find purpose, and the player wants that too. In the end, he wants to find the answers below Alamut. Now, what is Basim's motivation during the middle? The player's motivation is to learn more of the Jinni, but Basim barely even questions the Brotherhood until Nihal, after 3 contracts, suggests that he could learn more. I think without fundamentally changing the story, we could have the people in Basim's life ignite a more pronounced change within him. And further, we could give Basim an ulterior motive. Instead of pursuing Ning because it's the villain of the day, why not have Basim question Rashawn's advice of letting his past go? Ask, why are you so adamant that I leave it behind? And she could give a hint as to why. Something like, because one's past can consume their future. And have Rashawn refuse to elaborate until Ning is assassinated, because the mission is a top priority. The characters people loved were always motivated by something, and used the Creed as a vehicle to achieve their goals. Ezio wanted revenge and looked to the Brotherhood for strength and guidance. Edward wanted gold and fame and used both Assassins and Templars to get that. Arno wanted to solve De La Serre's murder and used the Creed as a way to get there. All of these characters by the end of the game realize that this Creed is not to be followed lightly, and that they learn to respect the tenets that they once agreed to for vendetta. Now, one could argue that Basim's story isn't about his rise to Master Assassin, it's really about his downfall. This is about Loki taking over his body, about a gifted assassin becoming a villain, and one motivated by his desire not to uphold the tenets of the Creed, but to find the mad one. Odin. While I like entertaining this idea, it doesn't change the pacing of the second act, it doesn't change said hero being nothing without his hood, and it doesn't remove the stench of untapped potential. Despite harping on this, and yeah, I know I harped on a lot, I still enjoyed the story. It's not my favorite, but it's certainly not bad. Basim is charismatic, and the surrounding characters follow suit entertainment-wise, and hey, the biggest praise I could give to the end of Mirage's story is what comes after. New Game Plus. Not only was this mode delivered pretty quick after launch and with some nice bells and whistles like a permadeath mode and unlockable dies for completing said challenge, they also made the amazing decision to let you skip the introduction. The beginning act is relatively linear, and being able to just skip to the important stuff is so refreshing because comparatively, there are certain games that could really do with that option. Replaying the game with all the tools pushes Mirage into a full-blown power fantasy, and permadeath alone is something that should be implemented in every release. With your death sending you right back to the beginning, every choice now has weight. You can't go into an encounter without preparing, notoriety needs to be in check at all times, tools need to be used sparingly, and stealth is a borderline necessity. Combat is to be avoided at all costs, and this tension multiplied the further I got in because it meant I had more to lose. The one issue with permadeath is that it further highlights issues with the game because there were many times where my run could have ended due to the game's issues. Basim jumping off of something he shouldn't have, missing a jump he shouldn't have, accidentally throwing a flaming jar at his feet instead of the people below him despite the game giving the indicator that it says otherwise. But I digress. The rewards here are excellent. You get a cool looking talisman and a bunch of black dyes for your clothes, which was enticing enough for me to engage with this mode that I otherwise wouldn't have. While technically, a no death run is possible in any game, I think Leo K nailed it when he said this.
But these free updates that introduce a bit of longevity in this way can be pretty nice. They expose players to these kinds of ideas. Even if they don't include it as a formalized, structured experience, if you try out the full sync challenge in Mirage, realize you had a good time, and then go check out other games you love to play, you can play permadeath in a lot of those other games.
So chances are after hearing where this game went wrong and the many ways it went right, you could see why I don't think it was enough to save the series. Mirage was fine, but we needed more than fine. It returned to the old Assassin's Creed games, but we needed more than that. We didn't need another another RPG game, that's for sure, but I think we needed something that built upon the foundations of the series, not try to imitate the precedent set almost 2 decades ago. I think this is why this game hasn't been talked about by general audiences as much. It's by the numbers. Die-hard fans have been enjoying it, and that's great, but we need more before buyer confidence is restored. Ubisoft Bordeaux knows what they're doing, and if given another chance to lead a game, I hope they do to its sequel what Assassin's Creed 2 did, which was take a relatively primitive series and allow it to flourish into new heights. Because as it stands, Mirage was not enough. It's a step in the right direction, and if I'm to put my faith in the series again, we need not just a more innovative game, but one that strikes a balance between not allowing the Brotherhood to shackle the person under the hood, and not focusing so much on evolving the Creed and pushing the series forward that we look back in a few years and barely recognize the steps we've taken to end up at this point. The novelty of returning to a game where we use hidden blades, stalk within crowds, and wear our insignias on our waist will only go so far. Make it a good Assassin's Creed game, but don't forget to make it a good game too. Mirage is a step in the right direction, and perhaps that's not high praise given what came before, but I'm happy with that so long as this isn't the peak. I want to see the series go further, reach higher, don't simply retell your same stories. Being gaming's high school heroes with each new entry saying, hey guys, remember how cool Assassin's Creed used to be? Want to hear Ezio's family again? Maybe I need to acknowledge what the series needed. After Odyssey and Valhalla strayed too far from the series' roots, fans were begging for an Assassin's Creed game before it was too late, before we had more RPG games and action-adventure titles, more titles about non-assassins and traditional assassins. We only have so much time before the series is unrecognizable, and Mirage, regardless of if it was good or bad, was an Assassin's Creed game. And I just hope that buys us enough time.
Are you fresh from the bazaar and new laden with goods? Do you worry how you will bear them back from whence you came? Then seek out العمل الذي كان عن صاحبه.